Hi, folks. We're just starting to open up the waiting room, so give us a minute or so and we'll let everybody load up and then we'll get things started here.
Okay.
Looks like mostly folks are in there. Lynn, is that right?
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. I see lots of familiar faces and names from previous sessions, so thank you for coming back. This is our fourth workshop / panel for our series, Impact Through Collaboration. And today our session is called Grant Providers. How do we assess success and failure? So we are meeting virtually today in the territory of Treaty 4. These are the ancestral lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis and Michif nations. And this means that these lands were these nations' territorial lands long before this place became Canada, and these nations continue to share these territorial lands through treaty and through other relations with all of us. I myself am a member of the Métis Nation, and I come from Treaty 1 territory, so I do consider myself a newcomer, a visitor to this territory. And with that, I have new relations to form and many new protocols to learn. So I'm so excited to introduce our panel today. By way of just quick introduction, I will introduce all of the speakers through a short bio. So starting with Tracy Mann, if you just want to lift your hand. Tracy has served as Executive Director of the Community Initiatives Fund for 11 years and has spent the majority of her career working in the nonprofit sector, including more than 25 years with grant-making organizations. Next, we have Robert Friedrich. Bob has had a 30-year career as a program officer and program manager for the Government of Canada. He has worked in 5 federal departments, including Employment and Immigration, Industry, Trade and Commerce, Secretary of State Department, Multiculturalism and Citizenship, and Canadian Heritage. And through this career, he has received many awards. Since leaving government, Bob has established 3 enterprises that support film, literature, and business. He's worked at the community level for Access Communications as a community producer, creating a number of shows, and he currently hosts his own show called Cruisin'. He has also served as a board member for U of R Alumni Association, Sask Writers Guild, Sask Culture, and numerous others. Our third panelist is Dave Slater from the City of Regina. He is currently the coordinator of community well-being and inclusion and has worked for the city for 15 years. His first job with the city was as a program leader at the Core Ritchie Neighborhood Center, which is an after-school program. He completed both undergraduate and graduate degrees with the U of R's Faculty of Kinesiology. His academic career has been primarily focused on adapted physical activity, inclusion, and accessible recreation for people with disabilities, while his thesis was an autobiographical narrative inquiry dedicated to understanding his own experiences of working alongside the disability community, and ultimately his interests in establishing belonging within recreation spaces. Dave lives with his wife, Rayanne, and 2 kids, Nora and Oliver. And our fourth panelist today is Karen Henders from the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. Karen has worked for many years as an assistant director and nature documentary producer before moving into program management. She was the program officer at Sask Film and then the creative industries consultant at the Saskatchewan Arts Board, now called Sask Arts. While at Sask Arts, she initiated and co-taught the Arts Entrepreneurship and Business Development course. Karen is currently the Director of Community and Grant Stewardship at the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. Although she has worked in other provinces, Karen has always called Saskatchewan home. Over the years, she has written many successful and unsuccessful grant and investment applications, and has served as an advisor and juror for funders and festivals. So welcome, thank you all panel for joining us. And we have the wonderful Dr. Michelle Stewart as our moderator today. Please take it away, Michelle.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Emily, for starting us off this morning and introducing all of the panelists. Yeah, and I wanted to sort of mark also the work that goes into this series. And so thanks not only to Emily this morning, who is our Indigenous Research Lead at the University of Regina, but also to Lynn, Kelly, and Dave, and everyone else who's been a part of this series. We're a number of talks in. It's been very awesome to have this sort of engagement. There's about 40 people that are here today with 70 people plus that showed interest in the series. And so there will be, of course, online engagement as well. So thanks specifically today also Lynn and Kelly, who will be doing some moderating for us. And using chat is a good spot if you want to open up. If you're newer to Zoom, there's a little, dialogue box. You can click chat. You can put questions over there. Kelly and Lynn will hold on to those. And there'll be a time in which we also go into a breakout session where you'll be able to have some conversations with your colleagues. So without further ado, we are going to go ahead and kick things off. So we are going to open up with our panelists for about 10 minutes at the top end. So I'll give them a 1-minute warning if they're getting really close to 10 minutes. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes right now to offer an overview of their organization and or experience adjudicating grants. And so we're going to start first with Tracy and then move our way through each of the panelists. This will give each person a chance to sort of talk about their project. Okay, so go ahead and take it away, Tracy.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm just going to do some sharing here. I appreciate the opportunity to join you all this morning, and it's great to see so many folks on the call. I know many of you are familiar with the Community Initiatives Fund, but for those of you who may not be, just appreciate the opportunity to provide a bit of a brief overview of who we are. And just 1 second. Did I do this incorrectly? I'm just gonna, this happened to me once before too. Hang on. Should go to. This one. I'll try this once more. Otherwise, I will just speak and not screen share. Okay. Doesn't want to move. So just a bit about the Community Initiatives Fund. We are an agency of the provincial government, and we were established for the purposes of receiving a portion of net profits from casinos Regina and Moose Jaw. We operate at arm's length from the government. We have our own board of directors. We have 4 adjudication committees who are volunteers with us and review applications and make recommendations to our board. In a typical year, we support up to 550 projects throughout the province and distribute $7 to $8 million per year to support those projects. Our mandate really is about enhancing quality of life and well-being for people in Saskatchewan. Our core program is the Community Grant Program. That has been our core program since we started. Even though we've had other programs that have come and go, this has been the one that's been consistently a part of what we offer. So within that program, we have 3 funding themes. One is healthy growth and development of children. The second is individual and community well-being. And our third stream is nonprofit and community leadership. Within each of those streams, if you are familiar with our application form or visit us to make an application in future, you will be asked to select which one or more of those 3 themes that your project is in support of. And once you select that, each of those themes also has a series of outcome statements, 5 to 7 statements per theme, that you were asked then to also identify which of those themes your project would be addressing And if you select them, then at the conclusion of your project, you'll be asked to report on those as well. So those vary according to the themes, but it's also an opportunity to demonstrate the alignment of your project with our particular funding priorities and objectives. Within the community grant program, we offer 3 application deadlines throughout the year. February 1st is typically for summer programming, and summer programs are those that are held between June 1st and August 31st and are really targeted towards children and youth. So things like, day camps or cultural camps or those kinds of things that help to keep kids active and busy and entertained over the summer months. Our other 2 application deadlines are April 1st and October 1st. And those are for programs that might be one time, or more typically, they are programs that are offered on an ongoing basis throughout the year. The maximum amount that you can request for a summer program is $5,000. And maximums for the April 1st and October 1st are $25,000. Or if your project is provincial in nature, and by provincial, it could be either a project that would be delivered in various locations throughout the province, or it could be a project that occurs in one place but draws people from throughout the province. And the maximum request for that is $50,000. So we have divided the province into 4 regions, so north, central, and south, and there is a regional map on our website that indicates where communities fall within those regions. And then, as I mentioned, the provincial region, which encompasses the province more broadly. And for each of those regions, we have an adjudication committee that is comprised of volunteers from those respective regions, so that they come with local knowledge about what's happening in those communities, what needs are in those communities and regions, because we know that it can be quite different from throughout the province. And we really rely on their regional expertise to inform our decision making. Most of our grants are awarded to incorporated nonprofit organizations. However, we do sometimes also provide grants to libraries through the health region, sometimes universities or schools and school divisions. But in those cases, those projects must be community-based and community-led, and not sort of the core programming of those particular institutions. So for example, we would not provide funding for teachers, but we might provide funding for a school nutrition coordinator or after school programming. So we're really looking to support things that are being led and are happening and benefiting at a broader community level. We fund a very wide range of different kinds of programs. So before and after school programs, programs for seniors to encourage health and well-being and activity and reduce social isolation, family resource centers, newcomer welcome centers, literacy programs, cultural programs, recreation programs, and as well supporting some nonprofit capacity building initiatives such as governance workshops or strategic planning or those types of things. A lot of variety for sure in what we fund, but in general, probably 60 to 70% of the programs we fund are supporting that healthy development of children and youth funding theme. We also have a few projects that are not eligible. So for example, we don't fund capital projects, so anything that involves purchasing large equipment or building renovations or desks for office furniture, those kinds of things. And we also don't typically fund things like fundraising events, or we don't sponsor trade shows or conferences, those kinds of things. But all of our guidelines and all of our eligibility requirements are available on our website. So we always encourage folks to have a thorough read of the guidelines before you are applying to CIF, just to ensure that your project is aligned with what our funding objectives are, and in some cases could save you some time if it's not aligned. So typically our application process, I've mentioned the 3 deadlines that we have. When applications are received, we do an initial review of those just to ensure that all the information that we require has been included. Sometimes our grants administrator will reach back out to you and just ask for additional information if something is missing. Once that process has occurred, then applications go to the appropriate adjudication committee, depending on the region that you've identified in your project proposal. Those committees make their reviews, provide recommendations back to our board, and then it is the board that has the authority for final approval of any of our grants. And following completion of their review, and then applicants are notified. So generally that process takes about 2 months from start to finish. And so we encourage you, when you're thinking, if you are thinking about applying, to make sure that you're applying at the right deadline so that it's in advance of when your project starts, as we don't do retroactive funding, for example. So, and then at the end of your project, there is a final report requirement that is due within 60 days. All of this happens online through our grants portal, including applications, all of our communications, and submission of the final report. We would encourage you, we have a number of resources that we make available to you to help you through the application process. So the guidelines that I've mentioned, we have also developed a guide to completing the application, as well as a sample application, which can be helpful, particularly if you are new to CIF, just to see what the application form looks like. And we provide you with some tips and tricks, and some of those we'll talk about today to help you complete that. And as well, some grant writing resources too. So those are all available on our website. And I think I'll close there.
Perfect. Very good timing. Thanks very much, Tracy. Next up, we have Bob.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I am a retired public servant, having worked for 5 different federal departments. So I guess what I could share today in a very brief sort of way is that I was on the other side of giving money away and designing programs, and thought I knew everything there was about grant writing. And then when I retired, people started asking me, well, maybe you could teach grant writing, and you could write some grants for us and do that. At first, I kind of resisted that, and then I started doing it. And then I realized, holy smokes, this is really challenging. I better sit down and figure out what this is really all about. It may sound strange, but when you're giving it away, there's one perspective, but when you're applying, there's another. So then I started working out curriculum and wrote a book, and then got on staff with a community college and that kind of thing. And what I always found was that there was a real solid benchmark things that I really needed to follow when I was writing grants. And those things were, first of all, did I read the guidelines? Did I understand what the program was all about? Did I actually talk to a program officer or somebody who knew something about the program? And did I take the proper time to prepare and put something together in a thoughtful way? And those are the things that I would like to share and talk about later. And I'll talk about a little bit about a personal experience that I had recently in writing a grant for myself, which was something new. I'm a bit of a writer, and I applied to an arts organization, and I found all kinds of things that I thought I knew, but I wasn't doing myself. So thank you very much.
Did you want to say a little bit more right now, Bob, or is that what you'd like to start with?
I think I'm good there. I'll talk
Okay.
a little bit more about my own experience writing other grants for other organizations and community groups. I do recognize some people out there. I see Rhonda out there, and I've partnered with the university and other groups to put on workshops. So shout out to you all.
Awesome. You're keeping me on my toes. I'm taking notes and putting them up on the wall. I was like, oh, Bob's done. Okay. Awesome. Thanks so much. And we will circle back. So definitely feel free to elaborate at different times with the next set of questions, or after that, Bob.
Yeah, no, I will.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. Dave, you're next up.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. Definitely some familiar faces I can see right now. I teach a kinesiology class during the week, and it's 50 plus students with black screens, and it makes me more nervous actually. So it's nice to see some familiar faces. So I oversee the community well-being and inclusion unit with the City of Regina, which includes a lot of things actually. So primarily our focus areas around homelessness, safe neighborhoods, inclusion, accessibility, and really supporting communities or segments of the population that face barriers to participation. I have a wonderful team. Kelly Husak is on the line right now. She's one of our team members. So I have a team, a policy analyst, community consultant, and Indigenous relations advisor, as well as a program specialist that oversees a bunch of direct recreation programs that we offer. So my unit's part of a larger branch, the social and cultural development, which also includes our arts, cultural heritage files, housing, heritage designation, plus the social development, community well-being work that I oversee. So our grant program is a community investment grant program. And one of the first decisions that a grant writer has to make in our program is which stream would you belong to. So we have three funding streams: sport and recreation, cultural development, and social development. So I oversee just the social development stream. We have 4 priorities in the stream, and so making a decision on which stream you are applying to has a lot to do with the priorities that lay within that stream. So our funding priorities in social development are around very similar to the work in my work unit. So housing, homelessness, and food security is our first priority. So if you're an organization that's supporting communities and offering programs that relate to any of those areas, that would be sort of a direct priority that you would relate to. Priority 2 is around safe neighborhoods. So if you're a nonprofit that's establishing programs that ultimately leads to safer neighborhoods, maybe that's through after-school programs or teen nights, or establishing inclusive spaces for vulnerable populations to go, that would be a direct link right there. Priority 3 is sort of a catch-all. It's social inclusion. And it's really speaks to organizations that support any of our sort of priority populations or more vulnerable populations in Regina, being the disability community, newcomers, gender and sexual diverse community, Indigenous communities, seniors, or at-risk youth. And then our 4th priority is around truth and reconciliation. So if you're relating to calls to action, or any actions that your organization is doing relate to those calls, that would be a priority that would fit. So those are our sort of 4 priorities in social development. Certainly, certainly the first step is sort of looking at the priorities that you directly respond to, but also keeping in mind those indirect priorities as well, that the programs that you may offer may indirectly respond to some of those other priorities too. I don't actually adjudicate grants. I'm not an adjudicator. I'm sort of glad, because I see I sit in the room and help the conversation, and I see so many good applications that I would honestly want to fund everybody, because the programs are just wonderful that come across our desk. So I think a unique service that the city offers is our community consultants. I have one on my team. We offer consulting services for leading up to our grant submission. So we'll work with the organization up until grant deadline, and sort of go back and forth on applications and help you where we can. We certainly can't read the minds of the adjudicators, but we have the experience in working alongside them and sort of know the little tips of what they're looking for. And we're in the room, I'm in the room to sort of guide the conversations. If there's questions about the organization that aren't clear in the application, I can sort of help the adjudicators navigate that. Typically our grant deadlines are in February, so social development, cultural development, and sport all have different deadlines that are within that sort of 2-3 week period in the middle of February. Typically our adjudication happens sometime in March, and if you're successful, you'll know sometime in May, and funding will come out shortly thereafter. So folks are eligible. There's sort of another decision you have to make in your application as well, as whether you're going to apply to the minor stream or a major stream as well. So the minor funding is anywhere from sort of the $0 to $10,000, and that could be an annual program that you do, or sort of a new initiative, one-time sort of pilot, or it could be capacity building for your organization. And then our major funding is anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000, and you're eligible for both. So you're eligible of up to $40,000, meaning you could apply for one major and one minor, or two minor initiatives as well, as long as they're not over the $40,000. I'll leave it at that for now. I'm happy to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Dave. And we have Karen speaking next. Take it away, Karen.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
You are? Oh, that's great. Okay. Now let's just see here if I can make it work. So it seems to be moving. So we have success. Thanks. There's a few, first of all, thank you very much for participating today. And thank you, Lynn, for inviting me. It's a really great group of panelists, and I've already learned a lot just listening to everyone before me. So I think what I'll do is talk a little bit about what a community foundation is. I know there's a few people on this call that I'm familiar with who have applied to the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, but we do find that generally people aren't necessarily aware of us, or actually how a community foundation functions and how it might be a possible source of support. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. Are you seeing just the slide? Is everything looking good there for you folks? Excellent, thank you. So a community foundation, South Saskatchewan Community Foundation is a charity, we operate like a charity. What we do is we grant to the South Saskatchewan as a region. So unlike a charity that has a very specific mission and mandate, our mandate is actually to support a thriving community in all of South Saskatchewan. So our mandate is very broad. We don't have a particular plan of action in terms of how we will support community. We actually are open to working in different ways, hopefully to have the best impact. And we do a lot of our work in partnership with people. As a charity, we typically grant only to qualified donees or registered charities. There are some ways that folks can apply to us if they're not a qualified donee or a registered charity through partnership with qualified donees. But generally speaking, that's the type of, that's how we work, is money goes out through granting to registered charities. So as I mentioned, we are a charitable organization. We're a public foundation. At this point in time, we hold about $80 million in charitable assets. And I'll get into the details of how that works and how it might be a possible source of support for you. We see ourselves as a connector and a catalyst, a builder and a leader. And again, we really work through partnerships. And we act as a bridge between philanthropists and charities, and hopefully help to connect philanthropists and donors with the needs in the community. And we do a lot of work through partnership. Our staff actually researches and understands community need in South Saskatchewan, and we produce the vital signs report. And we don't do that every year. The most current one is the one on the 50 vital community conversations, and that's likely to be our report for 2021 as well. And we share this information with donors and with community leaders and businesses. So on this slide, I hope will help to maybe explain a little about how a community foundation works. So as mentioned, we hold about $80 million in assets, and that money is all pooled and invested. And it's actually the income that it earns that we're able to grant. And as a registered charity, we're required to grant 3.5% of our assets in a given year. It's not always that amount because we're able to carry forward and carry back a little bit, but just as a sort of rule of thumb, that's how it works. Our board of directors follows an investment policy, and we have a finance committee that has knowledge and expertise in the markets. And we work obviously with financial advisors to help us. So that income is generated, and then it's used to make grants to qualified donees. So the donor, I won't spend a lot of time on this because this is not the focus of this workshop, but I think it's helpful to understand from a community foundation's perspective, money goes out the door in two different ways. One is through donor advised granting. So let's say if a family has established a fund with us, every year they will have, based on our disbursement rate of typically 3.5%, they will have a certain amount of funding that they can generate into the community through grants. And they can tell us every year how they would like that to go out. So that would be why some of you folks who are here as leaders of charities may get a grant from us unexpectedly. It could be that a donor has decided that this year, based on the needs in the community, that they think you folks are doing great work, and surprise, here's a grant. So that's kind of where all of that happens. And I always say it's a little bit like RSVPs. Some donors know exactly what they want, and so staff doesn't have to really work with them much, and they don't need much guidance. Whereas on the other spectrum, staff may help a donor actually through our research and our understanding of the community, try to identify what the most urgent needs are in South Saskatchewan. And I should have mentioned for our definition at South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, that is Davidson as south and then across to different provincial borders. So money can come to you unexpectedly through donor advised granting. And then we have really, which is the focus of this discussion, what's more typical, and that is grant deadlines. And we have approximately, on any given year, we have at least 5 grants that we operate. Some have a single deadline and some have 2 deadlines in a year. So typically our granting is deadlined in the fall and then again in the spring. And these are the main ones: the Joyce Gemmell, the G. Murray and Edna Forbes, the Moffat Family Fund, the Smart and Caring Fund, and the Lorne and Evelyn Johnson Foundation. I should mention that the Lorne and Evelyn Johnson Foundation is in fact its own charitable public foundation, and we co-administer the grant deadlines for them. So it has its own board of directors that makes the granting decisions. So sometimes that's not so clear for folks, so I wanted to share that with you. And then in any given year, we may also have special initiatives. We are a member of Community Foundations of Canada, and as a result of that, we have offered this last year the Investment Readiness Program and the Emergency Community Support Fund, which are both national initiatives with federal funding. And we ourselves ran an Emergency Community Response Fund to address COVID need. We also did the RBC Future Launch this last year. So there's various initiatives. I've put our website up there, sscf.ca, like the previous panelists. I do recommend that you go and check out our different deadlines and see if there's a possible fit for you. That said, I just share a couple brief things related on these particular deadlines. The Jean Murray and Edna Forbes Foundation Fund and the Lauren and Elwyn Johnson Fund actually will accept applications for operations and equipment, which I think is a rarity. So that may be something you might want to pay attention to. The Moffat Family Fund is focused on Moose Jaw area and is meant to support families and children to create a level and even playing field for everyone in that community. And interestingly enough, that money flows from the Winnipeg Community Foundation through the Moffat Family Fund to us. And we work with adjudicators in the Moose Jaw area to help us understand the best applications to support in a given year. Adjudication can take place with fund advisors or with our board of directors or with the community group that we've assembled based on their knowledge and expertise. It just depends on which fund it is. So I know that Emily shared a little bit about my background already. I just wanted to give a little more context in case it's helpful. Like Bob, I've been on both sides. When I was a television producer and an independent filmmaker, I applied for many grants and investments, and some were successful and some weren't. So I definitely have that experience. And as a consultant, I've been asked to adjudicate grant application and festivals, etc. So I've also had adjudication experience. And then as an employee at Sask Film, Sask Arts, and now the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, I administer and also chair the adjudication processes there. So I bring that different perspective, and hopefully that will be helpful to you when we get into the discussion questions. So just in case it doesn't come out specifically in the discussion questions, I just wanted to share some of the top tips of working with the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. I know several folks on this Zoom call are a member of our Vital Signs Community Network. And if anyone is interested, my email will be in the last slide, and we'll be sharing the presentations later. So please reach out to myself. We meet about 4 to 6 times a year. It's been a bit challenging, of course, with COVID, and it's just really an opportunity for folks that work in the charitable sector and folks that have a strong connection to the charitable sector to get together and share and learn what each other is doing, and to support that. We've seen a lot of partnerships come out of that discussion. And of course, selfishly for us, it's a way for us to stay connected with community and to learn more about community need. And also we use the Vital Signs, we are appreciative that we have the Vital Signs Community Network, because it allows us to run ideas by you folks in the charitable sector to see if we are on track and if we've strongly aligned our work with what actually the community needs. If you are interested in us, absolutely check us out on the website. But another tip is to actually look at our annual report. We list all our different funds there and the past recipients, and some of the stories that we highlight would give you a sense of what it is that we're looking to support in South Saskatchewan. And our most recent Vital Signs report, absolutely, you want to read that. Our Smart and Caring Fund, which is our discretionary funding, is in alignment with the research that we see there. So when you're applying to Smart and Caring, it is definitely around supporting the research and the needs that we've identified through research in the community. Like the folks who have spoken before me, definitely read our program purposes and our guidelines, and in particular the criteria that we use to assess the applications. That's all on our website. As a community foundation, we are very much broad in our mission and our scope, and we really focus our work on community. And we have deliberately tried to keep our application process as simple and straightforward as possible. So we have a motto: we only ask for what we need. So when you're looking through our application process, you may actually see that we ask for very little information, and we challenge you to write briefly, which, what is the saying? Pardon me, I would have written less if I'd had more time. It can be a bit of a challenge, But we don't want to waste people's time. So we can come back and ask you for more information, and we've structured it that way so that, you know, really that you don't have to do more work than is necessary. All of our granting is done through a portal now, so definitely check that out and get access to the portal early. Another tip as a community foundation is, well, I would say our final reporting requirements are actually quite simplified and brief as well, but do share stories with us. It's so important because then we share those stories with donors and the community. And it really helps the community to understand the good work that everyone is doing and also the needs in the community. And we do hope to share that wide and broadly in South Saskatchewan. And keep in touch with us. So again, this is focused on writing grants, but when you think back to my slide on donor advised granting, if you have a significant opportunity, meaning if you only had funding to do this, if you had funding, an opportunity would be if you only had a little bit more funding, you could do something very special or trigger or leverage new funding. Definitely let us know. Or conversely, if there's something that's gone sideways, if you've lost funding, etc., do let us know. Develop a relationship with myself or Lorna or Tiffany, and again, I'll share those emails with you. We never overpromise, but if we don't know what's going on in the community, we can't help you. But sometimes we can connect what the community needs are with those urgent, emergent needs with what the donors may wish to support. I've been on holidays, so I haven't talked this much for a while, so you can hear my raspy voice. I put my talk.
Karen, actually, is it okay if we hold on to some of the tips because that might be leading
I
into
just
the next
wanted,
set of questions?
Absolutely, I'm almost done here. I just wanted to say I put them on here so that people have them.
Great.
And then just here are the email addresses should you need to get in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Karen.
You bet. Now how do I unshare? That's the big one. Am I done?
You have a little button on the bottom that usually says like stop screen share, I believe.
Pardon me, folks.
It's okay. We'll pull it off in a second, or Lynn can take hosting back, and I think that usually collapses the screen sharing option.
Yeah.
Okay, the next set of questions we're going to put out, these will be in sort of a quick circle around. We're looking for the panelists to talk to us a little bit about the ways in which you've noticed any commonalities as it relates to a successful grant application. So what makes a successful grant application? Maybe some tips on unsuccessful applications, and of course, any advice you can give on how to write a strong application. I will turn it over to, let's start with Bob this time. Bob, are you still with us?
Yeah, I just tried to unmute there. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I always keep it on mute so I don't interfere with people. A little bit, maybe I'll relate a story of mine personally. I teach grant writing at the community college level and some one-off classes with the professional development element at the University of Regina and write grants. But it's not often that I write my own grants, and I'm a bit of a writer, and I thought, well, okay, I saw a grant at at an arts organization. And of course, I did all the wrong things. What do they say? If you can't do it, you should teach. So, not a good sign here for me. But it's easier, I found, to write something for other people. But I learned something as I did this for myself. It was an art project, and so I started writing the grant madly the day before, and contacting all the people that I needed to contact in a very short order. I didn't really review the guidelines, and I kind of guessed at what they were because I thought, well, I'm a kind of a smarty pants. I've written all kinds of grants. I didn't really talk to the program officer, and I put my budget stuff together very late in the evening, and I just went with my gut instincts. And about 5 minutes to 12, I hit the send button, and of course, it rejected it. And I thought, oh, what the heck did I do here? Of course, I did all the wrong things. And so meekly, the next day, I called the program officer at the arts organization and they knew who I was, and they said, well, come on, Bob, you should, why didn't you talk to us beforehand? And I said, well, I kind of, maybe I should have, and all this kind of stuff. And, they were just so forthcoming with good information. They were helpful. They told me what the criteria was, what the program was going to be, what they were focusing on, what kind of things were winning, what kind of things were losing. And, then I went back, I read the guidelines much more carefully. I took my time. I gave a lot of space. I reflected. I talked to my partners. And then my ideas, I put them together and I cut and paste them onto the application, took them back into Word, rehashed them, played with them a bit. And, when I gave myself time, when I talked to the program officer, when I read the guidelines, all the stuff that I teach people came back. And I think I did a pretty good job of it. But it was that 5 minutes to 12 kind of thing that really didn't do justice to myself. And I'm sure a lot of people have found themselves in that situation. So that's really what I had to share, is that it was a good learning experience for me to be rushing and trying to do things and going with gut feels. And they're all good. Nothing wrong with that. And I think the project I had, I think it's a pretty good one, but a good learning experience for me. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Bob. And those are really helpful for us to think with, right? There's the, what should you do when writing a grant? And then there's the, what actually happens when we write grants
Exactly.
sometimes, right? Yeah, excellent. I'm going to circle back. I'm just sort of taking notes right now of themes that are coming up in part so I can put some questions back to the panelists, but I think anyone who's listening is going to see some very clear reoccurring themes. And one of them is that time and preparation piece and communication. I think that can be a real intimidating thing to contact a grant officer. And I know I've been the one that's like meekly done the phone call before too, in part because I never quite knew what to expect when I would call a grant officer. And I think that most of us have had the experience where we're quite pleasantly surprised at someone who in a lot of ways can serve as a facilitator to help us better understand the grant organization itself. And if we're not clear about those requirements, right? But I think as Bob and everyone's telling us, that bit of preparation is a critical piece. Let's go ahead and turn it over to Dave.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I would agree. Certainly the communication aspect. I mean, we like to be super hands-on with it, and we're more than happy. It's part of our job to work with groups and support them through that process. So if folks are feeling at all nervous about reaching out, I mean, don't, for sure. It's part of our day-to-day job, and we want every group to be successful, although they aren't sometimes, because in reality there's a lot of great programs, and as we sort of see, as processes and programs become more competitive, with more applicants and more like really great innovative programs, people have to focus on their application and how well written it is, right? When it becomes that competitive, and really the story, making sure that your story is completely told in the application, backed with local research and local evidence to show that there's a need for this program. So a big piece I find in ours and every other grant, I'm sure, is really that demonstrating the connection between the gap in the community, the need and the impact of the program or service that you have. So what's that connection? Can you clearly articulate what the gap is in community and where the need is, and how your program is going to support that gap or that need? I try and ask when groups are trying to write about community need and community impact, I'll often ask groups to think about what the reality would be if their program didn't exist in community. So what would be the impact of your program not existing in community for that particular segment, and what would it look like when your program does exist for that community? So what would happen? My advice, it's advice that I actually got as a grad student. my area in kinesiology, it's prominently, quantitative, lots of research on, concussion, exercise, physiology, strength and conditioning, the very, very quantitative numbers. And then I'm, more qualitative. As Emily said, I did a narrative inquiry. So what that means is lots of writing about my feelings and my experiences. So when I wrote my first draft, like the initial feedback I got was, you need to write for all audiences. So you need to imagine that people's research that's focused in biomechanics and exercise physiology, they're not going to know what you're talking about here. So you need to explain this and write for all audiences so that they understand, they truly understand what you're getting across. And I think that applies to the grant writing as well. You can't sort of assume that people will understand what you're talking about. So you have to kind of make that clear connection and really tell the story. I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thanks, Dave. I think that that's another really important part. I'm taking notes back here, and there's all that preparation work that goes into deciding, do you meet the mandates? Are you eligible? Have you done the preparation? Are you in conversation with the granting manager, the programs officer? And then at some point you decide to write the grant, right? And so then it becomes really important. Dave has said a number of times that there's so many projects and there's so much important work here happening in the city, but anytime there's a funding cycle for research or for community work, what's that extra thing that you can do to potentially stand out on the deck? And here, one thing would be the extra time and attention to writing it, making sure it's really, really well written. And sometimes that does mean taking a step back and figuring out, is it accessible to people that don't work in your sector? We often need intersectoral collaboration. That means we have to write across the sectors, and it means that our granting evaluation, it means that sometimes someone evaluating you won't be in your subject matter area, and they have to understand what you're talking about as well, which is that communications piece that's critical, and we'll talk about that later. Thanks, Dave. I'll turn it over to Karen.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'll just build on that because a lot of my top 11 tips have already been covered, but the one thing that I would share, I think, which is common with successful applications, is that they tell a cohesive story. I think we sometimes forget that it's important to be able to clearly articulate why, and leading with your passion about what needs to be done in your community, why it needs to be done, is really helpful. And then having that story be told not just in the narrative, but also financially, and have those stories align and support each other. I guess it's not a successful tip. I often see applications that are unsuccessful where the financial story does not match the narrative. So that would be something I think that can be helpful. And I guess the other thing around successful applications, again, just building what folks have said, is being able to articulate on what basis you believe, on what basis you anticipate the impact. You may not be able to quantify it in numbers, but you can speak to past success. You can speak to and demonstrate community partnerships through letters of support, etc. But being very, very clear about why you think this is the program or the project to address the gap that Dave spoke about, and why now. They're competitive processes, so I think being very clear about that. And I just often ask that question, on what basis do you anticipate this to happen? So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thanks, Karen. And I think that sometimes when we hear about the competition surrounding granting, it becomes intimidating. You can anticipate who might also be applying, and and I've sort of divided things up in my head, and it's the same thing I do when I'm applying for money. Try to the best of our ability, do that background work, figure out if we actually meet the criteria, figure out if we actually do genuinely align, and then start to sort of ask these more critical questions as well. Why now? Why does this matter? And then what are these variables that are really outside of our control? And one of them is those letters of support. You know, again, it goes to preparation, but you have to ask for those letters. They're outside what you can kind of control, anticipating that impact, right? But making that part of that cohesive story that you're telling the funder, with a way to say how you might measure that. And I think that's something that we've talked about as part of this series in general. And Lynn, I'll turn that over to you later on to tell people how they can access the series that's been taking place over the year. But we also talked about evaluation and collective impact. And these can be intimidating things, but we have to speak to them inside of our grant sometimes as well. And as Karen said, part of our story, it's cohesive when we can make that budget align with the narrative and can tell the whole picture of the project, fiscally, and in the narrative as well as delivery. Thank you. And turning things over to Tracy.
So one of the things I always find when I participate in these types of events with other funders is that we all say the same thing. So I think one takeaway for everybody would be that regardless of who it is that you're approaching for potential funding and what their application forms might look like and the questions that they might ask, we're all fundamentally looking for the same thing. So so just to keep that in mind, and I think not to repeat what everybody's already said, because I don't have much left on my list that hasn't been said already, but it really is about, you know, putting forward what it is that you're wanting to do, why you're doing it, and how are you going to measure that you actually did that at the end of the day, right? And I think as everybody has said, that making sure that everything lines up in your application so that your objectives match with your activities, match with your budget. You know, make sure that you're honest in your budget. If you've applied to other funders, and if the budget form asks you about that, make sure that you include that. Honesty is always best, for sure. The other thing I would say is you want to make sure that you're answering the questions, but do that concisely and with brevity. From our perspective, at each deadline, we are typically reviewing 200 or more applications at any one time. And so it really is to your advantage to tell your story very clearly, very concisely, so that the adjudication committee members can clearly understand what it is that you're doing, why you're doing it. You know, why are you the best organization to be doing that? But that they can understand that easily. We hear a lot of frustration from our adjudication members if applications are not answered, questions aren't answered well or correctly. If there's a lot of very vague responses where they're sort of left guessing about what it is that you're wanting to do, as opposed to understanding what it is that you are in fact doing. And that, and if you have partnerships, you know, make sure that you speak to those. If you have other supports, make sure that you speak to those if there's a place in the application, because demonstrations of, and not even just other funders, but if people are contributing in-kind resources to your project, it speaks to that the community places value on what it is that you're doing as well, that it's not just that, you know, you've dreamt this up and you think that this is a great idea, but actually the community agrees with you that this is needed and a good idea for sure. And just to back to a point that Bob made, it is amazing to me how many people will be hitting submit at 1 minute before the deadline. And we actually changed our deadlines. They used to be midnight. We actually changed them to 4 in the afternoon, because people would be trying to submit something at midnight on a Saturday night, and they run into technical difficulties and they're trying to phone us for help. So don't leave it to the last minute. Technology happens. And if you do have questions as you're going through an application, then obviously at midnight on Saturday, we're not there to help you answer those questions. So you know, be submitting and working on your proposals well in advance of deadlines. And just to maybe reinforce something that's been said already by a couple folks, but don't start planning your project as you're sitting down to write the application. You know, the idea and the formation of your project proposals should start well beforehand, where you have opportunity to develop, to plan for it, to understand the resources that you need, and to be able to articulate that well, you know, in an application. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Great, thanks, Tracy. And I think that, you know, we asked in that set of questions, like, you know, what are some things that work? And then, you know, where have you seen some misses? And, you know, we do really want to focus on the strengths and trying to show our collective capacity to write grants well. But I do think, and I say this speaking from my own experience, I know what it's like to push a grant along and then be like, I can't find these things that I need, right? The 11th hour is rapidly approaching. And, you know, and I work in a lot of partnerships, and many times I've had to just say with the folks I'm working with, I think we need to pause and we're in the next funding cycle. And I say that for a number of reasons, and it's been alluded to here before. You know, there's a group of adjudicators that are reviewing dozens, hundreds, sometimes many hundreds of applications. You know, it takes a lot of time for you and your team to develop a grant. And if it's not well written, it's likely not to be funded. So is that the best use of your team's time at that moment? And I say that knowing that sometimes we're talking about budget lines that can pay for someone's job, you know, so we need all that extra advanced time to make sure we put the best application forward. But I do think sometimes that if you find that you are putting in vague answers, a number of the granting agencies here have structured questions, right? It's not an endless narrative. It's got structured questions that you answer. If you're struggling to find answers to those questions, or they're very vague, or you know that they're not really totally solid answers, if you're really not sure about your budget, if you're really guessing at that budget, you're trying to figure out how you're going to make the budget sort of hit close to the amount that's being potentially offered. If you can't get letters of support because you didn't make enough time to request them, and you know that that would really strengthen the application, you know, that maybe it is a next round conversation to have. And I don't see those as failures. I see those as moments where we've recovered a little bit of working time and we start looking at the other grants that are available. And you know, you've done 3/4 of the work towards the next funding cycle, but it really is the most respectful thing I think we can do for people's time if we didn't have the time available. Bob, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just thinking is that when I'm most successful in writing grants and, of course, in delivering programs at the federal level, uh, I put together what we call a logic model. And the logic model is really the core of every project. And I'll just go over it very quickly is that, and a lot of the speakers have already identified elements of it. But once I build the logic model, the first thing I try to really articulate well in any grant that I'm doing, and in programs that we delivered or I delivered, was what need or gap, some people talk about, are we really trying to address? And when I was a funder, I'd say we're in the market to buy this. We were in a, it may sound kind of crass to say that, but what need are you trying to address? And then what kind of outcome or change are you hoping to affect about that need? And then what key actions would you take to start to stimulate those outcomes? And who and where are you going to work with? And finally, I try to work with even clients and students. Let's get a 25-word description that articulates all of those things, because all of good, I notice most of the funding agencies now have computer programs, and you've only got 250 words, you've only got 100 words, and in the program description you got 25 words or 20 words. So I really try to work on those things before I start to fill the thing out. I actually prepare a formal proposal, which is what's the need, what key actions I'm going to take to address that need, who and where am I going to work with, and what change am I trying to address, and to put together a 25-word description. And then the final little trick that I do is when I'm in your application, or whether it's the Canada Council or Saskatchewan or whatever it is, I copy the question that you asked me and the question above. The City of Regina is really good at this. They have a very good question. So I take that question and I paste it back into the answer box, and I start answering all those questions that you have in that you've got above, because then it forces me to give you the right answer. not just looking at it, I'm actually writing answers to the question, paste in there, and then I take it into Word and I play with it in Word, and then I cut and paste it and put it back in. Anyway, those are some of the thoughts.
No, that's great. Thanks, Bob. And I think that these are the types of things that are really helpful. I know that there's a lot of folks on this call that are seasoned grant applicants, and then there's more junior folks, but there's always different ways to write a grant, and having different ways to think about writing a grant is really good, because otherwise we can become quite complacent. We have a formula that we work, and maybe that formula is also in need of being thought about differently. And so, you know, Bob's offering here a logic model, right? And as Bob said, you know, you can think about need, outcome, actions, partners, and then how do you summarize it in 25 words? It just really requires that you really like have a clear idea. And similarly, I believe Tracy, you know, ran down a list like, what are your objectives? How do they align to the activities you're proposing? And how does that go into your budget? For those that are on the line that have applied for research-based projects that can still have community application, what is your research question? Does your method answer your research question? And does your budget actually speak to all of those items? There has to be cohesion, and that's what we've been talking about throughout. The narrative needs to be clear and it needs to be accessible, because each adjudicator will read it differently, but ultimately they're trying to figure out, is this a well thought out project? Is there a need, a demonstrated need? And does this agency have the capacity to do the work, or this individual? Great, we're going to go into another set of questions. We've alluded to this a little bit, but maybe just more explicitly. Maybe we can just talk about some common mistakes that the adjudicators see. Maybe I will start this time with Dave. What are some common mistakes we see?
Thanks, Michelle. I think it's important for folks to, when they're writing, I mean, certainly if you're, we're all probably, you're working for a nonprofit, you're very passionate about the area, and that's sort of your expertise, your area. And I think it's important people sort of step back at times and let other people have a look and, does this make sense? Are we, making assumptions that people understand the issue? So sometimes when folks write grants, they sort of, we'll just sort of present the program and with, lots of jargon and not really sort of defined concepts that are maybe more particular to that, to that area, whether it's social development or culture. So it's, at times, I think that can lead to confusion with the adjudicators if there's a lot of sort of new language and new words that haven't really been, haven't really set the context or define what some of the language means. Again, and I'm not saying folks have to take our advice all the time, because we are wrong sometimes in the advice that we do give. But if we're offering, like, certainly, meet with us and have conversations with us. I do notice sometimes that that folks will put in applications with sort of a not like a specific program, like but more of a sort of umbrella initiative that's part of your organization, and then there's like a lot of different programs under it, which makes it confusing to the committee on, which one of these are we rating here? Is it all of them, or is it one? So I find it's important to like clearly define like one program, one initiative, and really do a good job of explaining that initiative or that program that you're looking for funding for, instead of sort of a umbrella with lots of different programs and initiatives under it. I also think, and this may be obvious, and probably you're all sort of experts in your field, but I also find sometimes language use can hurt an application. And what I mean by that is, is the language dignified? Is it deficit-based? Is it disrespectful? So are we sort of presenting something that comes across to the reader as, not dignified the way that we're presenting the program. So I think the important part is there, like, keep up with the changing landscape and the changing sort of language, and which is really hard to do in the inclusion field and social development field, because the language is changing lots, and it's very person-centered, right? What people want sort of the language to be. But so it's important, that's just a little, it's a very specific piece of advice, but make sure the language that you're writing about the community that you're trying to support is, respectful and dignified. Yeah, I'll leave it with that. Interested to hear what other folks say.
We've got an enthusiastic co-participant right now. Just be careful, okay? Thanks, Dave. I think that when we get to this level, though, of granting, and as always, every year, every funding cycle, the competition is stronger and stronger, which means there's a lot of important projects happening in the community. This isn't a bad problem, but it does mean that nuance is critical. And so language matters, the language that you're using. It was already said before, less is more, brevity, being concise. And I think that's a good point. And I can imagine a number of applications where I felt the need to explain the background, the way in which all the pieces of the puzzle go together. Ultimately, tell the story of the project you're trying to be funded, and tell it in the most concise way, and as Dave said, most dignified way, keeping apprised of the best language to use, but without getting lost in jargon, because each of those evaluators might not be in your particular subfield, but they are looking for particular language that shows that there's a dignity in the work that's going to be done. Bob, why don't you go next? I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reaffirm what he was saying there. When I thinking about evaluating projects and looking at many of the projects over the 30 years that I looked at, what I saw was that basically sometimes the budgets, and I think somebody alluded to this, I would look at the program description and I would see the budgets and I would say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? This was never talked about in your proposal. So that matching of the actions in the program with the actual budget expenditures is really key. I'm sure funders are looking at that still today. And also looking for that language that we're using in the program, in the discipline, to be reflected in the application form. And I think that really was something that I could read to an application and just, I hate to say it, in a matter of minutes. And if I couldn't find that stuff, it made it very challenging to start to get interested in the project. So good thoughts there on some of the other folks' parts.
Great, thanks, Bob. Next up, how about Tracy?
Yeah, so just to build on what's already been said, I think a couple of other things that we see. One is completing the budget seems to be a challenge. Lots of folks, we look for a balanced budget. We look for a complete budget for the project. We don't request full organizational budgets, but for the project that is being proposed specifically. And making sure that all other either confirmed or potential funders are included in that, but especially accurately completing the expense budget. And we ask for the full budget, and in ours, then we also ask specifically for of that budget, what portion is it that you're requesting from CIF. So that's probably one of the areas that we go back to applicants about the most, is just for clarification on budget items. And we do look for alignment with what they're proposing in terms of their objectives and activities, for sure. And the other thing, and just because I know that it's time consuming for people to sit and to complete an application, we still continue to get applications for projects that are ineligible under our guidelines. And so we always really, really strongly encourage people to do their homework, do their research first, look at the guidelines, ensure that what you were wanting to do both aligns with our funding priorities and is eligible according to our eligible and ineligible expenses. So I always feel badly when I see those applications come through to us, but so those are two things, is budget and make sure you do your homework first.
Excellent. Thanks, Tracy. And a couple of thoughts from Karen.
Gosh, this has been really good information. I think when we think about the budget, I will just say that often it's the in-kind that becomes problematic for folks. Not quite sure how to account for in-kind in their budget. So that's a really good reason to call and talk to us. Because what you don't want to have happen is for you to describe something in the narrative and then the assessors not be able to see how you will cover those expenses. So if you do have in-kind support, definitely you want to make sure that they're aware of it, because they'll think there's a gap. And also it demonstrates, community commitment as well. And I think that's very important. In the narrative side, I think Bob alluded to this, being very clear about what the criteria is and being able to, given the word count and given the questions that you've been asked to answer, to make it easy for the assessors to understand how your project or your program aligns with that criteria. Just make it as simple as possible. Think about the countless, be respectful and smart when you think about the adjudication process. Make it very simple to have the assessors understand the alignment of the work that you're doing with the actual criteria of the program that you're applying to money from. Deadlines. So, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. I would say that, given the timing of the funding, you may not have your program or your project tied up in a package with a neat little bow. And that's okay. Assessors understand that, but be clear about, if you don't know something now, be clear about how you will know something or how something will come together. And that a good example would be pending funding. You may have applied for other funding. You might want to talk a little bit about that. You've typically gotten that money in the past or you haven't, but just being very clear about that. Or maybe you don't have quotes and you need quotes, but the timing hasn't allowed you to get quotes, but how would you get a quote? What would be the criteria that you would use? Trying to, again, make it easy for the assessors and not hanging them up with questions that makes them then wonder the readiness. And I'm giving them some good comfort there. And if I have time, I will just suggest that one thing that, as a tip, I do recommend is to think from the end back. So what is the final reporting requirements? You said you were going to do what, you did what, so what? That's kind of how I frame that. And that can be a really good way to actually figure out how to apply and put your project forward in a very concise manner. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Michelle.
Great, thank you. And I think also demystifying that reporting piece, especially whether it's a new funding stream or it's new to you to apply for funding in general, just thinking that at some point there is the reporting piece, right? And even it's just making those calendar entries to remind yourself of the reporting requirement. But I think also something that's come up is that these types of granting cycles are also relationship building, right? And part of that relationship then is potentially the latter stage, which is the reporting part, telling the stories as we've been asked, right? Sharing those stories, it helps the agencies sometimes in recruiting additional dollars to the funding agency itself, but also it's good knowledge translation or exchange of information to be sharing the good stories and information that comes from the projects. Karen, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons, a common reason for not getting awarded is that the first time you applied and didn't get awarded, you didn't come back for feedback. And I think that ties into relationships. It is a relationship, and being unsuccessful doesn't mean your project wasn't a good project. It could have been it just wasn't the right time, or you just needed to. Maybe there were too many questions, and it's just about learning how to answer those questions specifically to each of the funders' needs. So I think don't be shy and don't think that it's a failure. It is an opportunity actually to strengthen a relationship and get more clear about how you can be sure your project aligns and put your best foot forward.
And I think that does go to that intimidation piece again. Sometimes circling back when we see, oh, we didn't get funding, sometimes we just mark it as failure instead of trying to figure out, like, were we pretty close? Where did we miss a beat? And then how can we further improve it? Because often it is a case of improving, refining, and bringing it back in again. Dave, go ahead. And then Bob.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, the budget conversation sort of triggered something for me. When sort of like, if you don't have your own space and you're wanting to offer this program like in a community space or a community center or a recreation center or something like that, partnerships are key, and they're looked at very positively by adjudicators that you put in an application with a partnership. So an example is if there's an initiative that you're renting a rec center and sort of within the budget, that's a big hit, like whether it's $500, $1,000, and at times on my end I wonder, well, have they approached the community association or the rec center? And I know this because I've sat on, I've managed a rec center, and when community groups have approached me and said, I have this really cool, early learning program or whatever it may be, maybe that's an opportunity that we partner with you, and you get that space for free because you're offering us a program that's free to the community, meets a need, fills a gap in community. Like community associations look for those partnerships, and other organizations do as well. So I think that's important too. Have you looked for opportunities to alleviate costs through partnership?
Great. I'm going to have Bob speak in just a moment here, but I'm also going to just sort of invite all of our participants. There's approximately 35 to 40 people listening to this conversation. If you have any questions, now is a great time to start to put them into the chat set part of the feed, and Kelly and or Lynn will start to take a look at those. You can send them privately to Kelly or Lynn, or you can just put them publicly and we'll bring them into conversation. Bob, what did you want to add?
One of the things I noticed at the federal level with some of the funding organizations, and it's probably getting truer at the regional level, is that this whole filling out of an applicant profile before you actually apply for grants, that has become a new screening tool. So let's say if you're applying to the Canada Council, they will get you to preload in who you are, what your organization does, and then they will turn around and tell you which programs you would be eligible to apply for. So there's just a whole new wrinkle that's coming along, and it's again valuable to talk to the program officer and to make sure that you're not shortchanging yourself.
Great, thanks, Bob. Waiting for some questions to load up. Kelly or Lynn, do you guys have any questions right now that have come into you?
I don't actually, so I would encourage anyone who can, if it comes to it. I do have a couple questions I can ask, but feel free to take the time.
Okay, I'll just read aloud here a comment that Rhonda just made. Language is important, and I appreciate that Davis said about respect and dignity. I also think about equity for people whose first language is not English or who have not had a high level of education. Adjudicators need to look beyond smooth words to where the needs and connection to funding objectives are best met. And I think that's a fair point. I think that if we get too preoccupied with whether or not the language is perfect versus the intent, I think that sometimes there can be a space in between. But Dave or other funders, did you want to speak to?
Yeah, we direct our adjudication committee members at every round of adjudication to understand the context in which some of our applicants may be coming from. And so many of them may be volunteers. They've never filled out an application before. They may not know all the great tips and tricks of completing an application, and applications may be a bit rougher, if you will, for lack of a better word. But we also prioritize supporting rural and remote communities and northern communities. And so what we try very hard to do is to be respectful of where people are coming from and their current capacity to complete an application, and to not let that be the deciding factor. The quality of the application, I mean, it's great when you get a well-written application for sure, but our assessments are based more on what is it you're trying to do and who will benefit, as opposed to how well you actually wrote your application. So we try really hard, and I agree the language is absolutely critical. We've said no to a few applications in past years because their language was not current or respectful, I would say, for sure. So we definitely take that into consideration.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I think that that's a good point that Rhonda's making, and I think that cohesion. There's a number of ways to demonstrate cohesion, and I think a commitment that aligns the objectives through the narrative and into the budget with a clear need in the community and capacity and community direction, which is one thing that we've really heard, right? That there needs to be collaboration, whether that's partnerships or agencies working directly with the community, but that the community is the recipient ultimately, even if it comes by way of an agency like a nonprofit organization. I might ask a quick question here to the participants. How has COVID impacted the work that you're doing as funding agencies? Whoever would like to take it away.
For us, so it's Regina Transition House I'm from. So what happened with us was people were afraid to come, like we had to shut down our group, like we had an outreach group. And so we had some monies attached to it, but we had to go virtual. So we had to change the venue, which was kind of interesting. Anyways, we went to virtual, so that there was a huge learning curve for us that happened for that. We also ended up with less kids in our shelter as well, so that was also part of our funding. So it was challenging because the folks that we normally reach out to and work with have just kind of withdrew and went back into their houses, and we were having a hard time getting them to come out and work with us. So, and it's just pure fear of COVID, right? Catching COVID and being in a communal setting. So,
Right. Thanks. And to the funding agencies, how has COVID shaped funding, delivery of funding, adjudication, funding focus?
I can start. We haven't changed our funding focus necessarily, but what we have been doing since March is working with our grant recipients around program adaptations that they're having to make and how they're delivering the programs that we are funding. And so we've tried to be as supportive as possible there within our eligibility requirements. We've also, and I've lost track of how many now, provided a number of extensions to programs. So where they thought they might be completing in August, now we may have extended them in, till next August kind of thing. So we continue to try and be as supportive and flexible as we can be, for sure. Going forward, our level of funding may be reduced with COVID and the closure of casinos and the restrictions currently. Our revenues are certainly at lower levels than they have been in previous years. And so we hope to continue to be able to provide our grant programs going forward, but we're not quite sure, to be honest, what that may look like. And so things are a little uncertain for us for sure into the next year.
Thanks, Tracy. Other folks?
I'll jump in. Like Tracy, at the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, we've tried to be as flexible as possible with extensions. And we've also seen a lot of requests for, I wouldn't call them material changes, rather adaptations of projects and programs. So changes to the budget because of that. And we're trying to work with as best we can. And the other piece, I guess, is to say that early on in COVID, we raised over $1 million to grant. And so generally, I would say we're busier than ever. And so we do appreciate the patience of the community. We haven't been able to get back to people as quickly as we normally do. But yeah, generally it's just been busier and just trying to be as flexible as possible.
Thanks. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I work with a lot of arts organizations and arts funders, and I must say that the federal and even at the provincial level, both levels, they've been very kind and flexible to us and have allowed us to keep money or move money forward and do a lot of different things that normally wouldn't happen. So it's not a good time, but it's been amazing what some of these arts organizations have been able to get. And I know there's still some pain out there, but there's been a lot of good things.
Awesome. Anything to add, Dave?
Yeah, we committed early on last March that, our as far as our funding goes, it would stay the same, and we'd commit to that funding to groups we currently fund, and the program wouldn't change. I mean, I think, yeah, similar to what everyone else is saying, like we just have to learn to adapt and have open conversations with groups. I appreciate and acknowledge, in particular in our stream in social development, that the needs are only intensifying. These aren't new needs. Homelessness is not a new thing. Housing issues is not new, but it's intensified because of restrictions that are there. But groups are, groups that offer, say, communal spaces for community to come in and warm up, or eat, or whatever it may be, recreation or social activities, like that's not happening. And that might be something that we fund them for. So it's, having that conversation with them, how can we sort of shift what you're doing, to reflect the funding a little bit. So we're certainly being really flexible on our end, and understand that a lot of these initiatives aren't looking the same as they were last year, and they may look different next year. So we certainly appreciate that.
Excellent. What we're going to do right now is actually we're going to take a little transition. We're going to throw folks into breakout sessions for about 10 minutes. It'll be a chance for a little bit of networking, which is always something that's usually something that happens with events like this, is that you have a chance to kind of mingle with people. So we'll create a little digital space for that. We're going to put folks into little breakout, like I said, for about 10 minutes. And really what we're trying to get at inside of this breakout conversation, a chance to network, and then also, in small groups, like, what have you learned today? And is there an outstanding point, either a question you have or a point of clarification that you'd like to sort of raise, either collectively or something jogs your memory when you're inside the discussion? Okay, so Lynn, I think that you actually have control, I realized, of this session. I can't create a breakout room. You can either make me a co-host and I can create it really quickly, or if you want to create a breakout room, it's up to you.
So Michelle, I'm doing that right now. I'll put people in 7 rooms, so that'd be 4 or 5 people in per room.
That's perfect.
That sound good? Okay.
Yep. All right. Well, you'll get a 1-minute warning when your room's about to collapse around you. So then you come back into the main session here. All right. Have a good chat. It'll be 10 minutes. And then Akla, you can join a breakout session if you're still there.
Sure.
Great. All right. And then they'll be in breakout for 10. All right. See you in a few.
Okay.
here. Awesome. Great. In a moment, we're going to check in and see if any questions emerged from your groups. But I do see that Terry has asked a question in the chat asking about federal relief. So would the federal government assist with giving funds? Do any of our granting agencies have any thoughts about that?
What is that question? I'm not sure what it means.
Well, I guess maybe is there any potential support coming in at the federal level that the granting agencies are aware of? For specific funders, Terry's saying.
What is she looking for? What does she have a little more specific thing? What I found with some of the arts organizations, there's been a lot of good turnover and generosity, but it's very difficult to answer that without knowing what area she's in or what she's looking for. What was she? And some people, Rhonda was just having a discussion with us about some things about her federal partner, which are kind of a yin and yang discussion. Maybe she might want to share a little bit.
From our perspective, because of the nature of our structure, we would not be eligible for some of the subsidy programs that the federal government is offering that are available to organizations in the sector, and specifically as a funding organization, and because we're created through a provincial act through legislation. I would not expect that the federal government would be providing funds to us, but I know, Karen, you may want to speak to some of the work that the foundation has been doing.
Anything to add?
Just at this time, we're not participating nationally in any federally funded programs. We just finished the last round of the investment readiness program and the emergency community support fund. But if more comes our way as part of the Community Foundation network, we will definitely share that via social media.
Great, thanks. Did any questions emerge from the discussion, the breakout groups?
We had one, and it was mostly in regards to preparing grant reports. So recognizing with COVID recently, there's been major changes to programs that have happened this year and that will also be taking or going forward next year. And if any of the grantors had any tips or tricks of what or how it should be communicated within grant reports, particularly for this past year, items that would help them showcase these changes and understand how things are and how this might lead into, excuse me, into the changes that we'll take forward into this next year. So sorry, I'll be more clear with that. What should they be highlighting and being clear in communicating as they look to adapt their programs from this past year and going forward? Go for it, Karen.
Sure. I would suggest being proactive and seeking first advice before making any program decisions. I mean, obviously something just may be out of your control, but I think it's always funders usually appreciate having you reach out to them and just discuss, consider them on your team, if you will. Discuss the challenge and what's going on, and then seek advice that way. And just don't assume. What you don't want to have happen is you file the final report with the changes and then you realize you've gone offside. In particular, might be ineligible. Like we've delivered several federal programs, and if you don't spend the money like you say you're supposed to, it could be a problem. So, don't make any assumptions, reach out. But it sounds like everyone's being as flexible as possible. So.
Great. Other thoughts to add?
Yeah, we also are happy to be as flexible as possible, but I appreciate Karen's comment that we really do and have been encouraging people to reach out to us first, just so that we can talk about what their adaptations have or what they're thinking of doing. We would like them to talk to us before they do it, just again to make sure that they're not ending up at the end of the project with you know, trying to claim for now ineligible expenses or those kinds of things. And you know, we've talked to, I think we're getting close to 300 of our recipients at this point. So I'm hopeful that everybody has been reaching out. Going forward, we just had an adjudication intake, and certainly within the current round of applications, you know, we were encouraging people in their proposals to talk about what their adaptations will be going forward. Again, to make sure that that they line up. And we also try to assess and understand what is happening at a community level. We try to be as supportive and responsive at what is happening, again, within our mandate and our ability to do so. So yeah, better ahead than later. Because the you know, going forward and asking for forgiveness later is probably not a good plan.
Anything to add, Dave or Bob? And then I see I have a James with a question.
Yeah, you know, certainly of course, we're being flexible too, and would, you know, hope that groups feel comfortable to reach out and have conversations. I mean, we have to appreciate the uniqueness of what we're living through right now. It's literally the first time we've been through a global pandemic, and we're switching to virtual. And particularly in my area, that's supporting vulnerable populations who don't necessarily have access to technology, and or, you know, the disability community in particular. It's a high risk, high vulnerable population that, you know, we need to take care of, right? So there's not the opportunity to come together in those spaces and sort of chance it, right? Like, you know, so in my sort of stream in particular, like, we just really have to appreciate the uniqueness of these groups and the services they offer. So, you know, happy to have conversations with groups leading up to submission on how you've shifted the way you're doing things.
I'll just get to see if Bob has anything to add. I do want to get to James's question, so maybe I'll get James's question mixed in a moment, and then I'll give every panelist just a chance for a final thought. Bob, anything to add on Kelly's original question?
Well, I think that the communication thing that we've heard from the funders, and people are still in the business of giving money away, is being in touch with your program officer, letting people know what your experience is and where you are. And I think people are open and sensitive to what the new circumstances are. And I think it's all about communication. That's what I find.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a reoccurring theme from beginning to end, including in these very kind of precarious times that we find ourselves in. James, did you have a quick question for the panelists?
First, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. It's been a really great conversation. I am now a student again, but also working in the community, and have been for years in both the nonprofit as well as the public sector, working for government. So it's more of a comment maybe than a question, but it strikes me as really interesting the leadership role that nonprofit sector plays in terms of policy, particularly around leadership and advocacy for the vulnerable populations that they often focus and protect and service. So oftentimes, though, that funding agencies do not see nonprofit leaders as leaders from a policy perspective. They see them as a consumer of resources, public resources that are then directed, I think, towards an end user in terms of a beneficiary. But the leadership is really critical when it comes to policy. And policy really, for me, fundamentally is about working with people and ideas. So does anybody care to comment just around that advocacy leadership role of nonprofits?
Maybe I'll just open it up and we'll have everybody sort of include a final thought. We've got about 5 or so minutes left. Why don't we start? I'll start with Karen and move to Tracy from there. So speaking to James's question, or any final things you'd like to include in a minute or so?
Sure, thanks James for that question. I think, I don't know that I have a good answer to it. I would just say from our perspective at the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, we do our work through the good work of the charitable sector, and we look to the leaders of those organizations, whether they be senior leaders or, you know, leaders every day. You know, we need them, and so we try to stay connected with them through the Vital Signs Community Network. But yeah, we're here for you folks, so do reach out to us. Thank you so much for your time. I guess my final thought really is that it is about relationships. You know, we need you as much as you need us. We can't do our work without you. And so just, you know, in advance of a deadline, in advance of it being a scary timing thing, read what's on our website, read about our programs, think if there's a potential fit. Do you see a fit? And then reach out to myself or Lorna or Tiffany and have a conversation with us. Once, you know, when you do that work in advance, you will ask us better questions and we will be able to give you better answers. And think of it as a relationship. And it may not be that you're ready yet or that you have something that does fit at that point in time, but you will know about us, we'll know about you, and hopefully there will be alignment, a convergence, if you will, in the future. So Lynn, thanks for inviting me here. Michelle, thank you so much for your great stewardship of this meeting, and Emily and Dave, thanks so much.
Great, throw it over to Tracy next.
Thanks, James. I totally agree with your comment, and I believe there's an incredible leadership in the nonprofit sector, and often not included at tables where that voice should be heard. Absolutely. From the CIF perspective, we're a funder, but we really consider ourselves to be in service to the nonprofit sector as organizations that are providing that leadership at a community level. And so, you know, to reiterate some earlier comments, hopefully people don't look at us as the bad guy or the big bad funder. We really here are on your side and want to be here in a supporting role for sure. We are a member of an unincorporated collaborative called the Saskatchewan Nonprofit Partnership, which has been a little bit quiet in recent months just because all of the members are very busy having to navigate their own organizations through many of the challenges that they have been facing for sure, but looking to have a place where there is a voice for the sector to take that forward and to certainly advocate for more involvement at a policy level.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Bob, final thoughts and comments to James's question?
Sure. I had the opportunity to do a little work with a nonprofit the other day, and one of the things that I'm sure they're all realizing is that COVID-19's had a real impact on us in a way that we never saw coming. It's coming out of left field. And I was fortunate enough to be on a national conference call with the fellow by the name of Rick Hansen, who had some real insights as to how do we deal with a catastrophic event. And if nobody knows who Rick is, he had a severe accident, became a paraplegic, and developed a worldwide organization that works with persons with disabilities and also creating accessible spaces around the world. And what he shared with us was that the first thing that happens when we have a catastrophic event is that we have to admit that something big and unusual has happened to us that's taken us right out of our wheelhouse. And then from there, we do some research as to what is this all about? What is this new reality? And also, you know, doing the grieving and all those sorts of things for the losses that we have. But then starting to say to ourselves, well, what's working in my life now with this new reality and what's not working? And how do I make a new battle plan to go forward so that we can be successful? And I thought that was quite something that Rick shared with us, and tried to work with this group that we were working with. And I found that innovation is abounding in the nonprofit community out there. People are working with ideas. They're learning how to work virtually. They're struggling, no doubt about it. But I think funders, as we've heard from these other funders, are working with us, and they're trying to help us also. So it is a difficult time, but we're also learning a lot of things. So thank you for this opportunity.
Great, thanks. Quick thoughts, Dave, and then I'm going to close this up.
Yeah, thanks for the comment, James. Certainly agree. The leadership in the community is incredible, and we've got to witness that firsthand since the start of the pandemic. We've pulled together service provider committees starting back in March. The one table had upward of 80 to 100 groups sitting around this table on Zoom every day at 3 o'clock. And no money attached to that, no funding conversations, but just a group of leaders in the community that care about the residents, and they, we're there to ask the questions like, what's going on? What do we need to raise at a senior leadership level? What do we need to raise with our emergency operations committee? So these are the groups that are, work alongside the community day in, day out, and they're telling us what the real issues are. And yeah, so learn so much, and we're still having those conversations with them today. And yeah, it's the leadership's incredible.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I'm just going to close us up really quickly here. So first of all, thanks very much to all of our panelists. We'll do digital high fives and virtual high fives. Thanks so much, as always, for everyone that joined us today. We'll do twinkle twinkle. Yep. So thank you, though, specifically here, Robert, Karen, Tracy, and Dave, for sharing your insights on the funding side, giving critical and super practical resource, information to potential applicants. Thank you, as always, to Kelly, Dave from the City of Regina, in this collaboration with the University of Regina that Emily and Lynn and myself have been participating in. I would really encourage folks, if you are applying for funding, right now you currently have on the phone or on the line, the phone, on Zoom, you have Lynn Jidluck, who is the community director for the U of R's Center for Engagement, for the Community Engagement and Research Center. So that's someone who can connect you potentially with researchers on campus that could assist. I'm on the line as well. I'm the institutional lead for community-based research. I'm also with the Saskatchewan Population Health and Evaluation Research Unit. Another great resource, Emily Grafton, who's the institutional lead for Indigenous research. And so you have a number of resources at the U of R to complement the amazing work that happens inside the community through the folks that joined us today. So thanks everyone for your time and joining us today on Treaty 4 territory, virtually, or the territories that you might be visiting from. Thanks everyone. And the Community Engagement Research Center is going to be loading up this series on YouTube probably next week. So you can look for an email from Lynn that'll have a link to this talk as well as the others that have already happened. Thanks everyone. We're 1 minute over. High fives. Have a great day.